Okay, let's get the show started. So, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Is the microphone okay? Okay. So, again, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Noam Lubel. I'm the Swiss Chair of International Humanitarian Law at the Geneva Academy. And today we're going to debate the use of autonomous weapons systems. I'll just say a few words to get us started, and I think it's important to clarify what it is that we're talking about. And the first thing to note is, of course, when we talk about autonomous weapon systems, we're not here to debate drones as we know them. And I know we have a picture of a drone there, but drones as they're used now are not autonomous. They might be in the future, but it's important to understand the distinctions between remote-controlled, automated, and autonomous. There isn't necessarily a clear dividing line between them. The drones today, for example, are a combination of remote control and automated. But just to try and make things a little clearer, when we talk about remote control, we mean systems that have a human operator that is able at any given moment to control the system. When we talk about automated, we talk about a system that can respond to particular events with pre-designed rules. So, for example, if X happens, it will do Y. And it's fairly predictable as far as that's concerned. When we talk about autonomous, we talk about systems that are able to sense what is happening, deliberate, and decide how to act in response to a more complex scenario which might not have been specifically pre-programmed. And they can do this without the involvement of a human overseeing them. The US military, for example, talking about autonomous systems, talks about systems that can select and engage targets without any further intervention by a human operator. Now, there may be all sorts of advantages and disadvantages to the use of these systems, and that's what we'd like to talk about today. There will be legal arguments for and against, ethical arguments, and just to give you an example of some of the issues that we will need to consider, on the side of the law, there are questions such as the ability of these systems to abide by the principle of distinction. And the principle of distinction is a fairly, in a sense, simple, but perhaps the most fundamental principle in international humanitarian law. And what it means, and most of you already know this, it's simply that you have to, at all times, distinguish between things and people military to things and people civilian. You can target these, and you can never intentionally target these. So there's a question over these systems, for example, as to whether they will be able to abide by the principle of distinction. Will they be able to tell the difference between a short soldier with a gun and a child with a toy gun? A sniper lying on the ground ready to fire a rifle, and a wounded soldier lying on the ground with their gun next to them. Now, some might say they won't be able to do this, so we have a problem. Others might say these systems may well be able to abide by the principle of distinction even more than we can as humans. So that's one of the issues that we're going to need to discuss. Another, for example, from the area of law is the problem of accountability. And how would we hold machines accountable? And assuming we won't be holding the machines directly accountable, who would we hold accountable from the humans? Programmers, developers, operators, commanders. So there's another debate to be had there as well. There are also plenty of ethical questions surrounding the use of these systems. For example, would the machines be, in terms of their behavior, ethically better or worse than human beings? Some might argue, actually, these machines will commit less war crimes, will behave, maybe not perfectly, but better than a human would. Others say, no, they're likely because of the inherent difficulties in abiding by certain principles, they're likely to make more mistakes, commit more, if you can call it, crimes, and therefore they would be dangerous to use. And then, of course, there's underlying all of this an ethical question of whether it's right at all to give machines the power to decide on taking human life. And again, there are arguments both for and against in that regard, and I'm sure we'll be hearing some of these. We're going to explore all of these questions in the format of a debate. And we chose this format for a number of reasons. Above all, this is a fairly new area of debate. And not everyone necessarily is aware of the basic questions that are being asked. And this particular format will allow us to see the positions in the most clear manner possible, to identify the strongest arguments for and against. And only when I think we have these positions clearly articulated can we really engage in an informed debate and make up our own minds on these systems. The other reason that the debate format was chosen is simply because we hope that it'll be more engaging than the usual conference. So rather than have sort of 4 people sit on a panel and give you all the ifs and buts and maybes, you can actually hear strongly argued positions with 2 people debating against each other. We'll also have a little vote to see what people here think. And we're lucky in that sense, and this is why I'm very confident that this will be an engaging event. We're lucky to have 2 of the best possible speakers we could have hoped for. We're very fortunate when we decided to do this event to have both Dr. Peter Asaro and Professor Matthew Waxman with us. Dr. Peter Asaro is an assistant professor and director of graduate programs at the School of Media Studies in the New School in New York. He's also an affiliate scholar at Stanford Law School's Center for Internet and Society. He is the co-founder and vice chair of the International Committee for Robots Arm Control, and has written and researched extensively on the intersection between robotics, autonomy, human rights, and just war theories. So he will be the perfect person to argue for the ban. And to his left is Professor Matthew Waxman. Professor Waxman is Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, where he specializes in international law and national security law. He's an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the Hoover Institution Task Force on National Security and Law. Professor Waxman has previously served in senior positions at the US State Department, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council. And he's also the author, together with Professor Ken Anderson, of a piece titled Law and Ethics for Autonomous Weapon Systems. So again, the perfect person to argue against the ban. And I mean it when I say that we actually, I can't think of 2 better people. If I could have picked any 2 people in the world to come here today to present these arguments, these are the 2 we would have chosen. So we are very fortunate and grateful that they came all the way across the Atlantic to join us today and enlighten us with their knowledge. The way this is going to work is we are going to have first Dr. Asaro presenting his case for the ban. He will speak for 15, maximum 20 minutes. We'll then have Professor Waxman give his presentation against the ban. They will then each have 5 minutes to respond to the case made by the other. And we will then open it up to a question and answer session with everyone here for further discussion. And within that discussion, we might then discover some areas of nuance that perhaps they chose to keep out of their initial black and white, shall we call it, arguments. Before we do that, what I'd like to do is take a little vote here in the room, because this is a debate. We have a motion for the House, and just see the state of play with regard to what people think right now, and we'll do that again at the end. And it'll be interesting to see if the numbers are the same at the beginning at the end of this event. So the motion under discussion that we've asked both the speakers to present on is, should there be an absolute ban on autonomous systems capable of using lethal force? All right, so should there be a ban on autonomous systems capable of using lethal force? So can I please ask everyone who thinks that there should be a ban on these systems to please raise your hands now, and please, I know it might be painful, but bear with me because I have to try and count. So hold on 1 second. And keep your hands up until I tell you can put them down. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Okay, I've counted 46. Okay. And how many people here think that at this point in time there should not be a ban, an absolute ban on such systems? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I count 27. All right, so we've got 46 for the ban and 27 against, and a fair number of people who did not raise their hand at all. But seeing this is Geneva full of diplomats, I guess we'll have to allow abstaining. Right, we will go ahead now. We'll have another little vote at the end and see if anything's changed. So, first to speak is Dr. Peter Asaro.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Noam. And thank you so much for setting up both this event and setting up the discussion and giving a little bit of background. I also want to start by just pointing out that actually in terms of the debate between Matt and myself, well, there's actually large areas of agreement in terms of how we see the problem and how we frame it and what we see the critical issues as being. So primarily, we agree on the notion of what an autonomous weapons system is. That this is about automated targeting and engagement without human supervision of weapons systems. So there's many different ways that we could try to define that, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that what we're not talking about is autonomous robots in general. What we're not talking about is all the different kinds of ways of automating various processes within the military, which could be navigation, manipulation, all sorts of things, but that we're really focused on these two very specific points about targeting, deciding what is a target, what's a legitimate target, and engaging, which means firing a weapon at that target. And that's really the issue about what makes it a weapon or a lethal weapon. There's also a variety of definitions that are out there, from killer robots to lethal autonomous robots, autonomous weapons systems, fully autonomous weapons systems. These are all really the same thing, right? What we're talking about is automation of targeting and engagement of weapons. And this could be coupling automation to a weapons system, right? Or automating an existing weapons system. Another way to think about it is whether we have a human being who's the authority to kill in a war situation or a conflict, who's then delegating to a machine the decisions to who to target, what to target, and when to fire. We also agree that these automated weapons systems are developing at an incredibly rapid pace. So there's certainly development efforts underway in a number of countries. We've seen automation being utilized by militaries in a broad range of ways, from drones, which have various kinds of automated systems, piloting systems, autopilots, systems that allow the aircraft to take off and land autonomously, even now autonomously from aircraft carriers. So really it's this question of at what point do we allow the automation of targeting and engagement, or do we prohibit it, or how do we regulate it? And we both agree that these automated weapon systems pose real and pressing dangers, especially in the absence of any kind of regulation or norms, right? So if we allow the development of these systems to go forward at their current pace and in their current directions, there are many ways in which they could threaten civilians in the battle space. They could threaten civilians outside of conflict areas, in policing situations, border control situations, any number of different applications that these systems could be developed for could put people at risk. And the nature of the technology is such that the simple systems are actually the easiest ones to make. So sophisticated systems that might attempt sophisticated discrimination between combatants and civilians are actually much more difficult, if they're possible at all, to produce, technologically speaking. So without any kind of regulation and norms, we could easily see systems that are really bad at discrimination or don't even attempt discrimination that could really pose serious threats. We also agree that automated weapons systems must conform to the laws of war. Things like the review of weapons under Article 36, they are not exempt. These are not exceptional systems in the sense that they are not subject to weapons reviews. However, we also agree that the existing laws of war are in some fashion insufficient. Unlike other weapons systems where we are fairly confident that proper application of the law would be sufficient to really govern the development and use of this kind of technology, it seems pretty clear that the existing law is insufficient, and I'll explain a little bit more detail why that's the case. And we also both agree that it's better to act sooner rather than later, that if we can establish norms now, we'll be better off in the long run, rather than waiting for these systems to be developed and then have to roll back or establish some kind of regulation or ban later. So what are the areas of disagreement? I think there's really 4 major points of disagreement that we have. I think in general, we have very different views of what the likely outcome of the development of these kinds of technologies is. Obviously, nobody can predict the future. There's many different ways that these technologies could evolve and develop. And you could say I'm the pessimist and he's the optimist, but I think it goes much deeper than that. I think there's some fundamental differences about how we think technology will evolve, how we think the legal frameworks can or should or might evolve, and also what we think the global impacts would be politically and the human rights impacts might be. And so I'll go into that in a little more depth. We also disagree on whether or not these systems are inevitable. We can see these trajectories of development in the technology right now, but Professor Waxman has argued in several papers that this technology is inevitable, that we're going to see it. I don't believe it's inevitable. I believe it's technologically possible. We could build these things, so in some sense, sure, they'll be there. But whether we use them, whether we develop them on a massive scale in elite military forces around the world and deploy them, is up in the air. This is not a settled question. It is not inevitable. I think we also disagree on whether or not autonomous weapons systems are wrong, morally and legally speaking, in and of themselves, or per se. I'll also go a bit more into the arguments that I have that they are wrong, per se, but I also understand that you could disagree with that. So whether you agree with me on what the likely outcomes are, or whether you agree with me about the inevitability of these systems, and whether or not you agree with me that they're wrong in and of themselves, the question before us is whether to regulate these automated weapons systems with a ban or with something else. And I believe the correct answer is a ban, and so I will also lay out the reasons why I believe that's the case. In terms of the technical possibilities, we already heard that this principle one is this principle of distinction and whether or not civilians and combatants could be reliably distinguished on the battlefield. This is, of course, a very difficult and challenging technological problem. Visual recognition systems are still in their infancy. Faces are detected as oval blobs of beige, right? And built into that, of course, is all kinds of racial assumptions about the color of skin tone and how that's distinguished against backgrounds in various lighting situations. The idea that we're going to be able to build robust visual recognition systems that are going to recognize combatants in uniform, much less combatants who are out of uniform, behaviors and gestures of aggression or military intention, I think are going to be incredibly difficult from a purely technological perspective. And I've been working in artificial intelligence for 20 years, I've also been working on the history of artificial intelligence and cognitive neuroscience in that sense, for the last century of research. And the level and speed of development, as impressive as it is in certain respects, does not lend me any belief that these systems are going to be possible anytime soon. There's problems that have to be solved scientifically to make these things happen. We're just not making progress on. We're getting faster and faster computers, but that's not sufficient in and of itself. And as we know from international humanitarian law, there are other situations that are incredibly difficult, even for humans, to make. Questions of when combatants become hors de combat. So when somebody is wounded and is no longer fighting, when somebody is attempting to surrender, questions like this. There's also issues of civilians directly participating in hostilities. The International Committee of the Red Cross has issued guidelines on how to determine this question of civilians directly participating in hostilities, because these are civilians who are then liable to be attacked in conflict. Criteria like threshold of harm, direct causation, and belligerent nexus, each of which are rather complicated to articulate in these guidelines, which are themselves somewhat controversial. The idea of programming that into a computer is challenging indeed. And computers are the sorts of things that should be pretty good at sorting one sort of thing from another sort of thing. That's something we've built computers to do. In this case, though, it's going to be incredibly difficult. The more difficult principle of international humanitarian law, however, is the principle of proportionality, because the principle of proportionality requires decisions to be made about values. And the source of those values is not so clear. So what is the value of a military objective relative to the likely civilian casualties? How many civilian casualties are acceptable to eliminate a tank, or an ammunition depot, or a fuel depot, or a bridge? What is the likelihood that bombing a certain ammunition depot is going to result in casualties in the school next door? These sorts of things we might like to think could be programmed in the computer, but these values shift and change over time. The military value of any target changes depending on the state of the battle itself, the strategies that are being implemented at the moment, and what's happening in other areas of a conflict. It changes over time, from the morning to the afternoon. It changes from the beginning of a war to the end of a war. The idea that we would pre-program these into a machine is absurd almost at this point. The idea that we can possibly perhaps devise machines that would allow us to turn some knobs and dials and adjust these values is also a bit naive, I believe. Essentially, this requires a lot of experience, right? And we train people, leaders, military officers, spend their entire careers learning how to make these very difficult decisions. And they don't know exactly how they do it. You can't ask them, well, so what goes into your calculation? And sometimes they use some software tools to assist them, but it's up to them to put the values in. Those values don't come from the software itself. And so I think for this reason, the principle of proportionality is something we're not likely to see anytime soon being observed or realized by these kinds of autonomous systems. So there's an even stronger argument that's made by Anderson and Waxman, as well as Ron Arkin, that these systems might actually wind up being technically superior to humans. That we'll be able to actually program the rules of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, rules of engagement into this computer systems, and they'll make less mistakes than humans, right? And this is a lot like the good old-fashioned Turing test. If you can't, as soon as you ask a bunch of questions to a computer and you can't tell the difference between a computer and the human, then the computer is intelligent. Or, you know, the kind of John Henry kind of technology versus the human. And as soon as the steam-powered shovel can dig a deeper tunnel than a human, we just have to give up and let technology take over. But the idea that we can program the rules of international humanitarian law is highly reductive and overly simplistic. What it really amounts to is rewriting the rules of distinction and proportionality. Because to write computer code, we have to interpret those rules. And once we interpret them, then we're setting them in stone in a sense, or at least in silicone. And we can't revise them, right? They don't change. And the way that they were interpreted by an engineer and a programmer and the way that they're actually applied in the real world is very, very complicated. And that's why we need human judgment. Humans are there to make sure that the rules that we've written, the Geneva Conventions and other things, are properly interpreted and applied in a specific context. And context is everything. So machines, they have no situational awareness. They don't really understand social context. They don't know how to interpret complicated scenes. They follow a bunch of rules, and these rules are very simplistic. And they don't know when their interpretation of the world is out of jibe with the real world. And humans, though they sometimes make mistakes, are much, much better at this. So it's not merely a question of whether we can devise some system that we could give it some, hypothetical test and it would somehow kill less civilians in an exercise than a human. Because this is also to say that what we're really doing is some kind of outcomes-based assessment of human rights. Why do we allow any mistakes, right? Why do we allow any civilian casualties at all? These are essentially impermissible in war, but we actually kind of grant human fallibility a certain level of compassion and understanding. We understand that soldiers make mistakes, that they're put in these situations that are very, very difficult. And so we grant them a certain degree of compassion. But why should we grant that same compassion to a machine? Shouldn't the machine be better? Would we accept an autopilot that had the same sort of crash record as a human? Wouldn't we want an autopilot that was much, much better than a human? So I think ostensibly we should at least hold technology to much higher standards. Oh boy, 5 minutes. All right, so I'm talking really slow. Process matters, right? And the human rights matter. And it's not simply a matter of outcome. But it's also about the space of possibilities of outcomes. So if we think about what this technology might evolve into, there's all sorts of different ways it might evolve. And the best case scenario is some situation where maybe we get human-like performance from these kinds of machines. But the more likely and far more numerous possible outcomes are situations where these systems do not approach human capabilities, where civilians are put in danger, where innocent people are killed. And we should avoid that outcome. Okay, so the systems are not inevitable. And I think there's really some more fundamental issues at play than just the number of civilian casualties in war. That there's more to humanitarian law than this. And in principle, these systems lack moral reasoning. They don't understand what it means to take a human life. And so if we're talking about delegating them the authority and responsibility to decide who lives and dies, when somebody's right to life is no longer important enough, right? That should be a human being that makes that decision. If it's a simple rule, and there's no way to verify that that rule is being applied to the world correctly, which is what is implied by saying that this is an automated system without any kind of human supervision, then that is essentially an arbitrary process. So we might have made some pre-planning about the code and the situation and things like that, but any killing through that kind of automated process, I would argue, is essentially an arbitrary execution. And in the words of Christoph Heinz, the UN Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Execution, war without reflection is mechanical slaughter. So I would argue that automated weapon systems are wrong per se. We could argue that they are mal in se, they're just wrong in and of themselves to allow machines to kill people. But I actually believe within international humanitarian law and human rights law, there are specific requirements for human decision-making. Indeed, the whole body of law that we've evolved over the last millennia assume that humans are making decisions. We didn't write the laws thinking a computer would make these decisions. And if we look at Article 57 about taking precautions in the protection of civilians when planning an attack, it becomes very clear that we assume there are leaders who have the qualities to make these kinds of judgments, who are there making these kinds of judgments. We do not assume that it's a computer program, right? Should we write the next protocol to the Geneva Conventions as computer code? Should we use C++, Java maybe? So I think there's actually a specific duty that we have as human beings to verify that the taking of the lives of other human beings is in fact warranted in each and every situation. And so, to quote my own paper, the human rights to life and due process and the limited conditions under which they can be overridden imply a specific duty with respect to a broad range of automated and autonomous technologies. In particular, there is a duty upon individuals and states in peacetime, as well as combatants, military organizations, and states in armed conflict situations, not to delegate to a machine or automated process the authority or capability to initiate the use of lethal force independently of human determinations of its moral and legal legitimacy in each and every case. Okay, so I have a couple of minutes to convince you why we need a ban. So I think it's really a decision between whether we're going to allow these systems to develop and then have a bunch of ad hoc best practices, codes of conduct, guidelines, see what works and doesn't work, which is the proposal of my opponent in this debate. And I think this is wrong because, one, these kinds of codes of conduct and guidelines and best practices are ad hoc. They're unenforceable. There's no binding way to make sure that other countries or any countries are actually enforcing these. There are no clear lines or norms established about what constitutes the proper use of these systems or not. It's a very complicated case-by-case sort of situation. It's also very difficult to reverse this process. Once these technologies are adopted and used, it'll be much more difficult to convince any countries to give them up that already have them. And we could look to two other technologies that have been growing very quickly in the last few years, drones and cyber warfare, which have followed this process, and ask, what kinds of regulations have we seen? What kind of leadership in terms of best practices are there for the kinds of policies and practices that particularly the US has been using with respect to drones? And how much transparency is there in the processes of cyber warfare? There's zero. How do we know what they're even up to? So I believe a comprehensive ban is really the route to take. It establishes a clear norm. What's wrong, what's right? What's wrong is to allow machines to make the decision about who to target and kill. That's pretty clear. It's enforceable. We can look at systems, we can see how they're designed, we can see how they're used, and we can determine whether a human was responsible and supervising that system in its targeting and engagement. This would also allow us, to if we have a comprehensive ban, to shape the emerging technologies. If we really want to increase the ethical decision-making of combatants, if we really want to reduce civilian casualties, all of these technological research efforts could be directed towards that, instead of removing people from the decision-making process. It's also feasible. This is not an impossible task. Just last week at the CCW, just a few blocks from here, they voted on a mandate to have a meeting in the spring to discuss this issue and whether further action is necessary. So it is already perhaps in motion to have such a ban in place. And it would be preemptive, which would mean that we would be able to prevent the use of these technologies before they're actually out there, which makes it much easier for militaries to accept it, because no military would already be dependent on that kind of technology. And there's precedents for that as well with blinding lasers. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asaro, for an eloquent and well-reasoned case for a ban. Now it's time to hear the other side. So, Professor Matthew Axman, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me here, Noam, and to our hosts. It's great to be here in Geneva, and a real privilege to be on stage with both Noam and Peter discussing this important issue. So my view, as is outlined in a paper that Noam and Peter referred to, a paper that I wrote with Professor Kenneth Anderson, is that autonomous weapon systems do pose risks. This, as Peter mentioned, this is an area where we agree. I do think that autonomous weapon systems pose major risks, but they also offer some advantages, not just military operational advantages, but I think also moral and humanitarian advantages. And my view is that they should be regulated, not banned. This is not a black and white decision between a world of anarchy with these systems running wild and an enforceable, clear ban. There's an important middle ground, I think the correct middle ground, which is that we ought to regulate these systems. And I think the best approach to regulate them is by adapting and supplementing the very robust body of international humanitarian law, laws of war, that already regulate weapon systems generally. Before talking about this in the context of autonomous weapon systems, let me make two very general points that I think inform my view on this issue. The first is that historically it has often been the case that new weapon technologies give rise to major fears that they're going to destroy existing legal and ethical constraints on warfare, that they're going to completely tear down the legal edifice that governs the practice of armed conflict. And I think this often raises questions, intuitive inclinations, that the solution to this is that we ought to ban these new weapons, especially if we can do so preemptively. This has been the story with some technologies going back centuries, the crossbow, the submarine, the bomber airplane, and so forth. Rarely, very rarely do efforts to ban new weapons work, I think especially when they do promise some military and humanitarian effectiveness. And often, while I think the claims of the sort of what might be called techno-optimists prove overblown, the promise of these weapons prove overblown, I think also the worries about these new technologies and the idea that they're going to undermine the existing legal and ethical constraints on warfare also prove vastly overblown. The second general point I want to begin with is that said, new weapon technologies like autonomous weapons do pose major challenges. And I think responsible states do have a strategic interest in adapting the laws of war to effectively govern a range of new weapon technologies. Peter referred not just to autonomous weapon systems, but also drones, cyber attacks, and so forth. And responsible states have a strategic as well as moral interest in setting a very high standard for complying with weapons reviews and law governing the use of these weapons. There are legal and moral reasons for this, but I also think it's in our collective long-term strategic interest. I think strengthening the laws of war or international humanitarian law in ways that strike reasonable balances between security and humanitarian concerns help accomplish our objectives, including effectively combating threats, combating atrocities, and so forth. And I think strengthening the law, strengthening international humanitarian law raises the cost to our adversaries or rivals who might try to gain advantage by violating those standards. So with those general comments in mind, let me turn to autonomous weapon systems. So no country, at least that I know of, has yet publicly evinced plans to use fully autonomous weapons specifically designed to target humans. Though some countries, including my own, the United States, have long used what we might call near-autonomous weapon systems targeting other machines, such as defensive systems aboard some naval vessels, without which a ship would be helpless against the swarm of small missiles coming at speeds faster than human reaction times. I think broader application of autonomous weapon decision-making, including possibly against human targets, however, will continue to emerge incrementally as greater and greater automation is built into weapon systems. Rather than seeing a sudden shift from human control to machine automation or machine autonomy, rather than a very rapid shift, I think in some contexts we're likely to see more and more aspects of seeking, analyzing, and firing upon targets being automated as the human role shifts very gradually from full command to partial command to oversight and possible override roles and so on. And I think this evolution is likely to be virtually inevitable as machine sensors, analytics, and learning improve. I agree with Peter that the idea that we will eventually use and deploy fully autonomous weapon systems is not, in a true sense, absolutely inevitable. My point here, though, is that that greater and greater automation being built into systems, I think, is inevitable. We already see it. As I say, we already have some fully autonomous systems to be used against other machines. And I would go so far as to say that it is virtually inevitable that some states will use fully autonomous weapon systems against human targets. I think there's a big question about whether those will be very smart systems or very dumb systems, those that comply with the laws of war and those that don't. But we'll come back to that because I think that's partly an issue that Peter referred to of compliance and the effectiveness, the enforceability of either a prohibition on autonomous weapon systems or regulation of those systems. But I do think this evolution is at least nearly inevitable as states demand greater protection for their military personnel as well as for civilians. And as similar automation technologies show that they're capable, for example, of driving cars or performing robotic surgeries very effectively. Activities, by the way, also with lethal consequences and with greater safety than human operators in the future. I think all of us in this room are going to find ourselves relying on driverless cars, for example, autonomous cars, autonomous surgical robots, and we're going to be doing so not because of convenience, but because they're going to be better than humans at performing some of these functions. It's going to be safer for us to have machines doing some of these functions in some contexts than humans. Now, proponents of banning autonomous weapons, especially through a global treaty, among other things, tend to argue that these systems risk dehumanizing warfare and thereby eroding ethical constraints on it. And they point out that artificial intelligence will never be capable of meeting the requirements of the laws of war to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, to avoid excessive collateral damage, and so forth. And as a moral matter, many of them do not believe that decisions to intentionally kill should ever be delegated to machines. And as a practical matter, they believe that these systems may operate in unpredictable ways or be used in very irresponsible ways, even perhaps in very ruthless ways. I think a treaty ban, however, is unlikely to work, especially in constraining those states or actors who are most inclined to abuse these systems. And it gives them an advantage of possessing such weapons if other states are banned, especially are banned even from research and development into weapon technologies that enable such weapons and perhaps enable autonomous defenses to them. Because automation of weapons will increase gradually, step by step, towards full autonomy, I also think it's not as easy to design and enforce such a ban as proponents assume. I do not think, and we'll come back to this perhaps in rebuttal or Q&A, I do not think that a ban is nearly as easy to construct and enforce as proponents often assume. Well, we can talk later about why I think the line between legal and illegal systems is not a bright one, the way that one might see in some other weapon technologies like anti-personnel landmines. In any event, if the goal is to reduce human suffering and to protect human lives, a ban may be counterproductive. Besides the self-protective advantages to military forces that might use them, it's quite possible that autonomous machine decision-making may, at least in some contexts, reduce risk to civilians by making targeting decisions more precise, firing decisions more controlled, and so on. And let me say, I am not sure that this is the case. This may or may not be the case. I would consider myself not a techno-optimist in this regard, but more of an agnostic. I think we do not yet know where technology is going to go, how effective artificial intelligence will be in this arena. I am open to the possibility that it will fail, but I also think that it is possible that it will succeed. Now, it is true that believers in artificial intelligence have at times overpromised before, but we also know for certain that humans are limited in their capacity to make sound and ethical decisions on the battlefield as a result of things like sensory error, fear, panic, anger, vengeance, fatigue, and so on. I bet that many of you in this room spend a lot of your time documenting these kinds of human failures. And I'm not just talking about abusive regimes that, as a matter of policy, routinely violate international humanitarian law. I'm talking even among responsible militaries, well-trained ones. I'm talking about a very significant possibility for human error, human failings. So as a moral matter, I think that states should strive to use the most sparing methods and means of war available, and at some point that may involve autonomous weapon systems. No one can say with certainty how much automation technology might gradually reduce the harms of warfare, but I think it would be morally wrong to, not to seek such gains as it can be had, and especially pernicious to stop research and development into such technologies at the front end before we know where technology might go in this area. Now, let me be very, very clear. This is not to say that autonomous weapon systems warrant no special regulation, or that states should heedlessly rush to develop them. And I do think that that has been an error in the past with some other technologies. I think that technological leaders in some areas have done a good enough job of thinking at the front end of their deployment and use about how such systems ought to be regulated on the international plane. But this, and so of course, autonomous weapon systems should not go unregulated completely. The dangers that Peter talked about are very, very real. But the choice, as I said at the beginning, is not between a ban and lawless anarchy. Ken Anderson and I have argued at length that a much better solution than a global ban is to adapt the existing law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law to deal with autonomous weapon systems. States should set very high standards internally, for example, for assessing legally and ethically any research and development programs in this area, especially with regard to baseline requirements regarding target discrimination and excessive collateral damage avoidance, and for continually assessing legally and ethically any use of such system. Importantly, I think states should discuss publicly as much as possible how they conduct such reviews, according to what metrics, for example. And for this kind of system to work, individual states can't go it alone. States should work collectively with like-minded partners to set standards and develop and share best practices. Such standards or best practices based on translating, applying, interpreting, and supplementing existing law of armed conflict might include, for example, strong presumptions against autonomous systems when safer alternatives exist, restrictions on contexts in which they might be employed, special review procedures for authorizing the use of any autonomous weapon systems. Although states, I've talked about states as the primary actors here, NGOs have important roles to play here in promoting and pushing for transparency and best practices. They should press states to ensure that the standards and processes of review take all relevant legal, ethical, strategic, and engineering factors into account. And they should also press states to be open about the specific content of those standards and processes, including how they conduct legal reviews in fielding new weapons. Having worked in the U.S. Department of Defense, I'm fully aware that there are limits to transparency here, but there are ways in which I think it behooves states, especially those states at the forefront of technological development here, to be as open as possible, especially with how they conduct reviews and according to what standards. I think the ICRC and its traditional role in fostering dialogue regarding proper standards, proper processes is important in this area as well. And just as development of autonomous weapon systems will be incremental, so too do I think development of norms about acceptable uses and systems will be incremental as well. So let me conclude by saying that autonomous weapon systems are not inherently unlawful or unethical. I think existing legal norms are sufficiently robust to enable us to address new challenges raised by robotic systems. And the best way to adapt existing norms to deal with these new technologies is a combined international and national level dialogue designed to foster some common standards to spread best practices. And now, taken as a whole, let me just note that this reflects a rather traditional approach, relying on the gradual evolution and adaptation of long-standing law of armed conflict principles, distinction, proportionality, weapons review, to regulate what seem to many like revolutionary technological and ethical predicaments. But that's in part because I think the challenge of regulating even radical innovations in weapons and reconciling them with long-standing legal and ethical principles is hardly a novel challenge. Some view the emergence of automated and autonomous weapon systems as a crisis for international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. But I think to the contrary, provided we start now to incorporate legal and ethical norms adapted to these kinds of weapons that incorporate emerging technologies of automation, the movement from automation to machine autonomy can be made very much to serve the ends of law on the battlefield.
Thank you very much, Professor Waxman, for a thought-provoking and strong case against the ban. So what we're going to do now is to have each of the speakers respond to the arguments just made, and they'll each have 5 minutes to do that, and we'll then open the floor to questions and answers. So Peter, please, 5 minutes to respond to that.
Sure. Thank you for that. I didn't hear too much that really speaks against the ban. I think there was more in favor of regulation as a better option, but not necessarily why a ban itself would be ineffective. I think it could be very effective. I think actually it would be much more effective than regulation. The idea of these regulations that would be very complicated, very nuanced, a sort of hair splitting that would evolve over time. How do you enforce that? How do you convince militaries that look at these technologies and can't really see the subtleties or the distinctions that are embedded in there? What's going to restrain their use or their development of technologies that in many respects look similar or function similarly? I think having a very clear line about the authority of humans to supervise all the use of targeting and lethal force is much clearer. And it's much easier to determine forensically. So if we think about how difficult it is already for human rights groups to verify a chemical weapons attack and who's attributable as the source of that attack, it's very complicated. Now we think, oh, maybe all the decisions about this are being made in some computer system remotely, where there's no access, where there's no ability to verify the code. These are going to be very difficult problems to solve going forward. And I think Professor Waxman also argued that a ban would lead those who are most willing to violate it to be the ones who develop it. And I don't see that being the case. I mean, I don't think a ban or a prohibition is ever going to be fully effective that you can stop anybody from using it. But having a very clear norm, and when that norm gets violated, having the possibility of engaging real sanctions against the people who would use it. And again, I would point to chemical weapons and biological weapons. It's very easy to say that when that line has been crossed and that there can be sanctions about it when it is. And also with chemical weapons, let's think back historically. In the heyday of the chemical technological revolution a century ago, chemical weapons were argued to be incredibly humane, that these were going to be a much superior form of warfare than guns and cannons were. Then there was World War I. And people changed their opinion very, very quickly about the humanitarian value of chemical weapons. And that's why we have a ban now. It's not that it's in principle impossible that there's some more humane way to use chemical weapons. It's because we know the more likely way that these weapons are going to be used and the way that they were in fact used is actually quite horrific. And I think the situation will be very similar with these systems. And so we have this opportunity to preemptively ban them, and I think we should pursue it. And I'd also like to argue about this idea of the regulation sort of being this happy collaboration between a bunch of countries. I think one of the real dangers here is the possibility of arms races, both globally and regionally. As different militaries start developing these technologies, and we're already starting to see in certain theaters, such as the South China Sea, where the development of these kinds of automated systems is very much in respect to the development of other militaries' systems, that there's going to be competition and there's going to be attempts to outdo one another. The sharing of this technology or the best practices about how it works, the sharing of how these systems actually work is very unlikely without a multilateral international agreement that these systems should be regulated, prohibited in a very specific way that would allow the kind of transparency as well as the confidence between competing states that other states aren't pursuing that technology. With the absence of a ban, I don't think you're going to see that kind of cooperation.
Thank you, Peter. Matt?
Sure. So let me summarize by way of rebuttal a couple of points. The main reason that I think a ban is inappropriate, is not the right way to go here, is because many of the gains of a ban, I think, can be achieved through regulation within the framework of the laws of war. But by banning up front these technologies, you forego the possibility that they may be not only better protective of soldiers, but better protective of humans. You answer a very, very difficult empirical question of whether advances in artificial intelligence will ever allow for better decision-making, reducing error when it comes to hitting accidentally civilians or killing civilians in the crossfire. You answer that question now, once and for all, before we've allowed technology to develop, and you forego the opportunity that that technology may actually save lives. It may actually be more humane. Under my approach of regulating, we have an opportunity to see how these systems are deployed, and we can make some of these decisions later on. And we can ban some systems, and we can ban the use of systems under some circumstances in some contexts, while allowing the more humane, better, more protective technologies to develop. That's point number one. Point number two is I don't think that a ban is nearly as easy and enforceable as the proponents of a ban claim. And the reason for that is that while it seems like a nice bright line rule, let's just ban autonomous lethal systems outright. A system that is fully autonomous is very, very, very similar in design and effect as one that has some minimal human oversight. And I think the better way to think about the distinction between those two things is not by drawing what I see as an arbitrary line between a system that has some minimal human oversight and one that makes decisions autonomously but very, very accurately. I think better to judge systems by their performance. by their performance. That's the way that international humanitarian law operates in practice, for example. I think, look, I would like in a utopian world to think that bans take hold. Having worked on the regulation of weapon systems and practices of warfare in the past, I think a much more realistic way to get better regulation is through negotiation and sharing of best practices among responsible states that are actually using and developing these technologies. It's true that sometimes bans on weapon systems work, although I think the track record of them is often overstated. I think, for example, the Landmines Treaty has largely been successful, although these days we see a lot of landmines, except that we call them IEDs. I think the Chemical Weapons Convention has largely been successful until Syria gasses large numbers of its people. And the way that we enforce, the way that we hold, or I wish we held, Assad and his government accountable was not because we can get inside the engineering of those chemical weapons, but because we see very visibly the effects of those weapons. I would much rather think about how do we improve the system of enforcement of IHL by looking at when atrocities are committed on the battlefield, when force is used indiscriminately, than focusing particularly on a few technologies that make us uneasy. I think, for example, while I'm talking about Syria, I think personally it's a mistake to have focused so singularly on chemical weapons. Because while it may be the case that the international community is now, with the help of a very strong ban on chemical weapons, going to remove those weapons from Assad, the Syrian arsenal, sadly, tragically, atrocities continue on a very, very constant basis there. This, to me, is part of the problem with trying to regulate warfare by going after particular technologies as opposed to thinking about how do we better promote and enforce some of the baseline principles, such as distinction and proportionality.
Thank you very much, Matt. So we're going to have some time now for questions from the audience, and I hope there'll be plenty of questions so we get to hear a lot more of what both our speakers have to say. Do we have a microphone? Okay, well, the first one, quickly with a hand up there, was here at the front.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm hardly an expert in this topic, but my question is directed to Mr. Waxman. You elaborated, you went into detail about regulation, but could you elaborate a little bit more on your idea of accountability?
Sure. You know, I think one of the arguments, and Peter touched on this, I didn't have a chance to talk about it very much, but I think one of the arguments that I hear most often in discussions about autonomous weapon systems is a concern about accountability for war crimes or violations of law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law. If a decision to fire is taken by a machine, who should be held responsible for that, criminally or otherwise? The soldier who allowed the weapon system to be used, the commander who chose to employ it in a particular circumstance, the engineer or designer of a system. In some circumstances, to be sure, I think there will still be some human decision makers who can be held individually accountable for either grossly improper design or grossly improper deployment and use of an autonomous system. A decision to use one of these systems in a particular battlefield context, for example, is still going to be a human judgment, and one for which individual commanders could be held accountable. But I think generally that a narrow focus on what's often a post hoc judicial accountability for individuals in war is a mistake in any case. I think accountability is indeed a very important aspect of this, but accountability is not, in my mind, an end in itself. It's a means to ensuring compliance with the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, and promoting the ends of that law, including reducing the humanitarian harms, the ravages of war. I think it's just one among many mechanisms for promoting and enforcing compliance with the laws of war. And I actually think also that the use of robotic systems may again, I'm agnostic on a lot of aspects of the technology because we just don't know yet. But the reality is that in some cases the use of technologies, new technologies on the battlefield may allow for a much clearer evidence of how decision-making was programmed than humans. It's true that we can often bring a human into court and ask that human why he or she made a particular decision. We have no good way of testing the reality of that. And so I think there are some limits that we have to acknowledge in existing accountability mechanisms, but I also think we need to look beyond just any one accountability mechanism to more broadly how we promote the ends of the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law on the battlefield, and I think technology holds some promise there.
Thanks. Peter, you want to comment?
I would agree to the extent that the reason we have accountability is to enforce a kind of responsibility in decision makers. And if those decisions are being deferred or delegated to a machine, then what sense is responsibility really being taken? Supposedly the supervisors of these machines are then responsible at some level. But I think what we see with automation and what we see in human psychology is that as more and more systems become automated, it becomes easier for individuals to not take responsibility, to believe that the system has, in some sense, this form of responsibility, even if that's not true legally. I think psychologically and behaviorally, this tends to be the case. And we've seen this in some psychological studies of Patriot missile operators and the existence of automation bias, where this is a supervisory system or the targets are automatically selected and the human can override them. But humans rarely override them because the machine ostensibly knows more than they do about the situation, which resulted in several friendly fire incidents of US and British aircraft being shot down by the system. So I would argue also that there's a question, a very serious question, about accountability in terms of war crimes, where to have a criminal activity, you need criminal intent, mens rea. Insofar as machines have no intent, all of the killing that they do is sort of unintentional at some level. We may have atrocities, we may have terrible accidents, but in what sense can you call that then a war crime? So maybe that's a distinction we no longer need to make, but I think it's actually an important one, and I think allowing people to be in these situations where they can take actions for which they can have no criminal responsibility, or put them in charge of machines that act in such complicated and unpredictable ways that it would actually be in some sense illegitimate to hold them responsible for what that machine does because they could not have possibly foreseen it. It would be very dangerous sets of situations.
Thanks. I'll just briefly add to that in terms of the points that Matt was making. Of course, when we talk about the technology giving us an advantage, it can work both ways in that, for example, you'll have video logs of everything that happens on the battlefield, right? So allegations of war crimes, you look at the recording, you see what occurred. The difficulty, of course, we have that, for example, with drones now, but it doesn't get released publicly. So there's the plus and the minus. You can get it, but do we actually ever get to see it? The other advantage, of course, is when they come back from the battlefield and you ask what happened, the robot won't lie. So again, you could see that as an advantage in that sense, but at the same time, as Peter pointed out, if you actually need to hold a human accountable, it can be very difficult if we tell the humans that these machines we put next to you are smarter than you. Would it be fair to hold the human accountable? And I think there's room to also think about, will we ever see a day when we say we punish the machine? The robot unlawfully killed someone, let's put the robot to sleep. We see that with regards to danger posed by certain animals sometimes. So will we see similar legal arguments emerging there? So there are some interesting points. The next hand I had was the gentleman holding the white paper there, yes. And I've seen a few more on the end of the row. Sorry.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thanks to the speakers for their intervention, and congratulations also to the Academy to put on this very interesting event. I would have a question and a very short comment. Actually, the question is on Mr. Waxman, you spoke about what I agree, the difficulty of conceiving and enforcing a ban. But I wonder what are your arguments, or how do you see why is designing and enforcing regulation easier? So this would be a question on that. And then a remark on what also you, Mr. Professor Waxman, mentioned, the role of NGOs. I wonder if this isn't a little bit a naive, or let's say optimistic view of civil society, because we did see, of course, actions in the Human Rights Council, in the General Assembly for more civil society space and engagement, but when you ask them to press for more transparency and a better use and enforcement of regulations regarding autonomous weapons, how would you expect that in countries, in regimes where we virtually don't see any possibility for civil society to engage and to act? So where do you, isn't that a little bit asked too much of civil society while letting regulation allow too much of, activity by states? Thank you.
Great, and let me begin by just adding to the previous point. When it comes to accountability, because it relates to this, I think it's important to remember that individual accountability on the battlefield is one form of accountability. I think when it comes to IHL, I think most of accountability, and often the most effective type of accountability, occurs at the state level, holding states accountable for decisions that they make with regard to how they wage conflict, what kinds of systems they deploy and use, and so forth. When it comes to regulating as opposed to banning systems, look, I think both the ban approach and the regulate approach do have some important and challenging enforcement and compliance issues. I think an advantage of operating within the existing law of armed conflict is, like I say, it already exists. We already have systems for internal reviews of weapon systems, for example. We already have, at least with regard to certain kinds of systems, transnational, international dialogues about best practices, about how systems ought to be limited in their use, and so forth. When it comes to transparency, though, and for me this is one of the big lessons of the picture of the drone is no longer up there. I look to the last 10 years of the history of drones as quite instructive here. Not just instructive for how NGOs and other elements of civil society ought to devote their efforts to trying to promote compliance with certain standards, especially by pushing states to be more transparent. But I think one of the lessons that the United States I hope learns, and this is one of the things that Ken Anderson and I argue in our paper, is that I think the lesson of the past 10 years is that the United States government, the United States military, has overinvested in secrecy, underinvested in transparency with regard to standards for research and development, and especially use of new technologies. What we're proposing is that instead of a ban, that the United States, along with like-minded partners be more committed to not just setting high standards when it comes to research, development, and use of these weapons, but being willing to talk about them publicly. Now, look, I think there's, for both Peter and I, we're both arguing about what we would like to see happen. I think both of us, for our proposals, face an uphill battle. It is very, very difficult to regulate weapon systems like this. But I hope that one of the things that the United States government and others see is that if they want to avoid what I see as an ineffective and actually operationally and morally dangerous ban on fully autonomous weapon systems, a better way to head that off is through the kinds of cooperative regulation that I've been talking about.
I would just reiterate the fact that enforcement can take many different shapes. So one would be this kind of black box, or the recordability of what these systems contain. Another is that I think to have any kind of real strategic advantage from these kinds of systems, you would have to build them on scale, right? It's not like a nuclear bomb where just having one killer robot is going to allow you to take over the world, right? You need armies of these things. So if you have a large-scale development program for these kinds of systems, that's going to be observable at some level. And it's certainly once you start using them, that's also going to be observable. Well, how did you get a whole army of robots over here without any kind of telecommunication system, and clearly you've been violating this regulation. So I don't know that enforcement at that level, especially of use, is going to be terribly difficult. I think inspections and understanding how these technology works will be challenging, and getting transparency is always challenging, but I think the same would apply, obviously, to any kind of regulation, however you choose it. The advantage of the simplicity of a ban, as well as the comprehensive and multinational status of it, is you also, you shut down arms races, you also shut down proliferation, and so the bad actors in this system are going to be much smaller, they're going to have fewer resources and less technology to work with.
Thanks. Okay, so I have one row down, and then I have the front row, and then there, and then one at the back, and then one in the middle. I'll remember you all. And one over there, right. Okay.
Okay, thank you for your wonderful insight. But however, I do find out what quite interesting is both of you rely pretty heavily on analogical reasoning, which I believe is probably not very suitable if we talk about robot warrior, whether you call them killable. I prefer the term robot warrior, because the fundamental difference between robot warrior and all the other weapon system is a robot. It's not a human. So basically, there are two fundamental characteristics a robot different from the human. One of them is called consistency. The other one is called empathy. A robot is consistent in a way that it has bugs, so it will malfunction, but that bug could be patched. A robot does not hate its enemy. It will never use derogatory racial terms to quote them. They will never wipe out a village just because the other fellow robot was knocked over and killed. Oh, you can't really kill a robot, you destroy them. However, the problem about this robot warrior, the other problem that we did not talk about is the problem of empathy. A robot warrior would not make war humane because, honestly, a robot can't feel any empathy. And war remains a humane thing to do. Although it is certainly bloody, it's because humans go to war and they understand what it's all about. If we talk about analogy here, the only analogy suitable here is the drones. The drone pilots, I mean, obviously some of them do suffer from the PTSD, but I would say there's a fair amount of drone pilots is entirely dissociative from the activities they go to each day, other than getting grocery shopping and going home, which is fighting war. How could we ever possible to... We're talking about international humanitarian law here, but I think this is fundamentally something unfit for international humanitarian law to do, is regulate a war-fighting unit that is not human.
Thank you. So there were 2 points there, the consistency and the empathy.
Yeah. Should I start this one? So I think they're both valid points. I think there's introducing these kinds of technology and automation, whether it's drones or whether it's these kind of fully autonomous weapon systems, has pretty dramatic and profound psychological implications on both sides. I have another paper that I've written on the psychological characteristics of drone operators and post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a complicated story. So it's not simply that they become these trigger-happy PlayStation warriors who think everything's a video game, and it's also not the case that it's simply high levels of psychological stress. They have a very different way of engaging in war, and it has stresses that are in many ways unpredictable. I think these other technologies also do that, but I think the general towards reducing the number of personnel engaged in war has other ramifications that are of social concern, not necessarily legal concerns, about the number of people who have to sort of consent to war, the ability of dictators to have these kinds of robot armies that they could turn on their own civilian populations who would fire on their comrades without question, and what that means in terms of the disparities of power and wealth globally, as well as what it means for democratic nations to consent to their nation going to war, how it transforms understandings of risk and the costs of different people going to war, different countries going to war. It tends to reduce the human cost, at least on the side of the party with the technology, and it turns it into an economic cost. So there's a lot of complexity there. I don't know that it clearly shakes out in favor of anything in particular for a ban, but it's certainly all concerning.
Yeah, so a couple of points there. I would say that in general, let me say I agree with you generally and intuitively on the importance of empathy. But I think empathy can be introduced at a variety of different stages. There's the stage of empathy on the battlefield in which a shot may be fired, though oftentimes I think that empathy is compromised by many other emotions that may take over at that time. But I would like to see empathy built in at the research and development stage, at the decision to deploy a system. I think that's what weapons review, I think that's what international humanitarian law is all about, is empathy is sort of baked into the system at multiple levels. Now, there is an issue that Peter alluded to earlier, which is that perhaps we should make a societal choice that, independent of consequences of how well machines might or might not work, how well they might or might not perform in the future, we should declare that the application of lethal violence should never be delegated entirely to a machine. In my mind, what matters morally is the ability to consistently behave in a certain way and to behave at a certain level of performance. And I believe that there's at least the possibility that I do not want to rule out preemptively with a ban, a possibility that in certain contexts, machines are going to be more discriminating, more life protective, more humane in their application of force than humans. And while I share intuitively, I think, a moral preference that all else being equal, I don't think we should delegate to machines lethal decisions. I, for one, would not be willing to say, I'm so committed to that moral principle that I'm going to ignore the counter-moral principle that we ought to try to save lives. To me, if we can save lives and be more humane in our performance, that is a moral principle that to me is paramount. I'm not willing to forego that out of a vague commitment that it sits wrong with me to delegate lethal decisions to human beings. Let me say, just briefly on the issue of reducing the threshold by which we might go to war because technology removes risk to humans. That's a separate issue that we might talk about in greater length. But again, as a moral matter, I think if states, especially responsible states, are able to use military force while saving the lives of their soldiers as well as civilians caught on the battlefield, I think that is to the good.
Peter's itching to...
A brief rebuttal. On this issue of the kind of moral psychology and decision-making, I think it's also important to look to cognitive neuroscience and what it tells us about decision-making. And so-called rational decision-making, we tend to think of Spock and logic being purely applied. But the way humans actually make decisions is to mix together values and emotions with logical reasoning. And that's what actually makes our decision-making more effective in these realms than computers, because they don't have those advantages of emotions and values that are actually essential to a lot of more complex decision-making tasks. And I would also argue that, you know, the idea that a ban is going to prohibit us from developing any of this glorious technology that's going to save civilians, that if you could design some sensor or some computer system that's better able to distinguish civilians from combatants, that's better able to make calculations about the impact of collateral damage from a particular attack or strike, that same knowledge and information could be given to a human being who's still responsible for making the ultimate decision about whether to follow it or not and whether it's reliable information or not. And so I don't think, you know, a prohibition is going to prevent us from developing any of these technologies. Software is very flexible.
There's a large number of people who still want to ask questions, so I'm going to take 2 questions at a time now. And can I ask you to try and keep the questions as brief as possible so that we manage to get through all the people waiting? So I have the gentleman at the front here first.
Yes, the last ones to come are always to pay for the ones who have talked too much before. But before asking my question, I have to do my own survey. So I like to know who in this audience has ever visited an armament show like Eurosatori or Millipol or the like. 1, 2, 3, 4. May I ask which show did you visit? Okay, it will be too time consuming. So obviously, in each debate, there are at least 2 debates, 2 levels. One here is pro or con drones, and the other debate is whether can we think war in a house of peace. So it is not the time to discuss whether the name of this house has been ill-chosen. It should surely not be the house of war, and probably not the house of order, as order has a bad name since 1938. It could be the house of response, which would be more suggesting. I know that next week or this week there is a session on war, but this is very, very rare. We all know that technology changed life, society, thinking. We discuss that in any possible perspective in any domain, from homework to, let's say, information and medicine. But when it comes to war, we just don't discuss it except in moral terms. The debate today is a moral debate, and it's going to be closed before it really opens. So this is my question. This is my question. Where can we actually discuss war without having a foreclosed debate? And as far as the, let's say, human empathy and limitation to violence is concerned, I remind you thereof that in World War II, all German cities were destroyed, although it was totally useless military, because there were bureaucrats who addressed a list, starting with Aachen and ending with, I don't know, Zist, and each day they had to make a cross facing the city which they had destroyed in alphabetical order. So from that point of view, I am not sure that drones will be worse.
Thank you. In the 4th row, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for these thought-provoking presentations from both of you. To make it short, Professor Waxman, you've mentioned several times possible restrictions on context within which autonomous weapon systems could be deployed. Could you elaborate on that? And also, I was wondering, Dr. Asaro, I've heard of a poll, a representative poll among Americans, where we see that the resistance towards autonomous weapon systems is particularly strong among people having a connection to the military. And I was wondering whether you could perhaps explain what that is all about. Thank you.
I'm going to take one more question now, just so that we can grab a few more. Just in the middle, over there.
Thank you very much to both of you for your brilliant presentations. I have two questions for each of you, and full disclosure first, I'm for a preemptive ban on killer robots. I've been working for 34 years with landmine and cluster munition survivors, including the last 20 on banning these weapons. Bans do work if the conventions are implemented. I didn't expect to be incensed by these presentations today, but I am, because for me it's black and white that a preemptive ban is the only solution, as with blinding lasers and dum-dum bullets, rather than after you see the effects, as with chemical and biological weapons. My questions are two. What is your response to computer scientists like Noel Sharkey and others with iCrack who say machines cannot be programmed to distinguish between civilians and combatants? I mean, these are computer scientists saying this, and we don't have a crystal ball to see in the future, but I just do not see how that could be. And number two, what about these systems being hacked? I mean, I'm a cyber skeptic. Every time my computer, something happens with it, it terrifies me, and it terrifies me that a machine that has been delegated the decision to kill could be hacked by the people that you say are most likely to abuse such systems. I will not be alive to deal with the effects of killer robots if they ever are put in the field, but I hope I will be alive to see that they are banned before they ever make the field.
Thank you. And as much as possible to respond to everything, but briefly.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. And at the end of his last remarks, Peter acknowledged that software is flexible. In my mind, I think he's quite correct. And part of the reason I enjoy participating in events with him is because I learn a lot about the science and technology aspects of this. In my mind, though, it's that technological flexibility that is in part the undoing of a ban. That unlike something like landmines, where it is easy to draw bright lines about what is an illegal anti-personnel landmine and what is not, or relatively easy compared to some other technologies. I think drawing a line between what I understand, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, a fully autonomous system and one that has some level of human supervision that can be manipulated, can be turned off through software engineering, is not an easy one to draw, is not an easy one to regulate. In terms of some context, I would say, for example, that among the best practices or standards that I think would be that I would promote would be the idea that autonomous weapon systems, for example, might only be allowed in settings when it is clearly demonstrated that the performance level of the discrimination performance level of a machine is likely to be much greater than a human. So, for example, in urban combat, I would say that that's a system in which machines, at least for the foreseeable future, are unlikely to be able to meet such standards. In terms of the possibility of hacking, yes, this is a big problem. It is not unique to autonomous weapon systems. It's unique to all kinds of systems, including drones that we have now, as well as the kind of human-machine interface systems that, that Dr. Asaro talks about being fully appropriate, even in the event of a prohibition on fully autonomous systems. What do I say to Noel Sharkey? I have great respect for Noel. I learn a lot from every discussion that I have with him. In my view, I take very, very seriously, because of his great experience in working with artificial intelligence, his skepticism. I'm not willing to draw the same policy conclusions that he is in terms of cutting off the possibility. Again, the possibility. I'm not a techno-optimist that knows for sure that technology is going to deliver in this way. That's why I believe in careful regulation, but I do think that there is some possibility that in some settings it is going to operate better and more humanely than humans, and I think it would be both strategically and morally wrong to preemptively ban that possibility from coming to be.
Thanks, Matt.
Well, on the Noel Sharkey issue, he's my colleague, and we agree almost 99%. But maybe he thinks it's 100 years or never. Maybe I think it's logically possible, but not very likely that we'll ever develop the technology. And I think hacking is a serious concern. I think there's a number of other serious concerns as far as the unpredictability of fully autonomous competitive systems, which we've already seen in stock markets and the flash crash at the New York Stock Exchange in 2010. When you have competitive algorithms operating against each other, there's incredibly unpredictable behavior. That caused the biggest loss of value in the stock market in its history in a 4-hour period. They were able to roll it back. You can't roll back warfare, so we don't really know what's going to happen when these systems engage one another. And these are a range of concerns. I think a ban is the most appropriate way to address. In terms of the first question, I think there is this very, very deep issue about the way in which these technologies transform not just our practices of war, but how we conceive of the morality of war, right? These technologies have the possibility to transform the norms that we operate under, and we saw this extensively with aircraft and submarines. And I think largely the international humanitarian law that we have in place now was written in the sort of wake of that, the atrocities of aerial bombing in World War II. But if we look at submarines, we sort of accepted a reversal of 300 years of the laws of naval conflict that said that ships had to rescue shipwrecked sailors from any ships that they sank. And that was actually the admiral that issued the order to the German submarine fleet, Admiral Doens, was tried at Nuremberg for this as a war crime, because he gave the order for submarines to no longer attempt to surface and lend aid to shipwrecked sailors. But he was found innocent and acquitted because the US and Allied forces did the exact same thing. Right? So we actually had a transformation in the norms that had been centuries old in naval warfare. And I think that's very dangerous to have this kind of regressive morality, that we're going to sort of adjust our morality downwards to meet the demands of technology or military necessity, and that over time we should be trying to enhance the moral standing of our laws, and that we should think, well, gee, just because we accepted mechanized warfare and aerial warfare and all of these things over the last century, that maybe as we move towards the future, we can actually enhance the kinds of moral responsibility and decision-making and capability of these machines to reduce the kinds of issues that we're most afraid of. And then the middle question about opinions of military personnel. I've spoken to military audiences quite a lot about this topic, and I find very clear reactions from low-level soldiers. They're absolutely terrified of what these things are going to mean for them, or the fact that they're going to have to operate them. But I think the most powerful views are those of military commanders, the low-level to mid-level officers, who are actually the ones who are in the field making these kinds of decisions on a day-to-day basis, because they understand the difficulty and complexity of this kind of decision-making, and find it as absurd as Noel and I do, that some computer program is going to somehow be able to translate these abstract requirements of international law and the rules of engagement to these very, very complicated and evolving situations on the ground.
Thanks. I'm going to be very trusting and naive and just allow the final hands that I saw, but please, brief, and the answers are going to have to be very brief as well. So there was one there, and there was one there, and one there, and then that'll be it.
Thank you. Very quickly, mine is not so much a question as it is a comment that invites further comment, and I think that the suggestion is generally that anything less than a complete ban is going to be utopian. That a complete ban, is going to be utopian, but I would argue the opposite, that anything less than a complete ban is utopian, because anything less than a complete ban is fighting wars that people aren't fighting, and it's wars that are based on the principle that the world police, the G5, the P5 states are holding themselves to different moral standards than quote-unquote rogue nations, when everything that we've seen over the last 10 years affirms that they're not below or above any of the so-called atrocities that they attribute to rogue nations. So I wonder if we could just comment on that. And one last point is children. I have in my mind throughout this presentation the video that leaked on The Guardian a couple of years ago about a drone attack in Iraq, I believe, that took out 5 or 6 children. And the soldier was completely convinced that he was doing the right thing, and you can hear him speaking over the video, but then, you know, at the end of it, there's children who are dead. How do we expect, you know, you talk about all these attributes of people and the negative attributes, panic, fear, and decision-making under panic and fear, but then you have the other side of it, which is sympathy, generosity, empathy, things that you can't program into a machine. So how do you account for these kinds of things that even soldiers themselves have not been able to account for, which is the presence of children in battleground and the presence of, you know, people who aren't able to defend themselves? Thanks.
Thank you. The gentleman there.
Thanks. I'll try to make it short and crisp. The first question is to Mr. Waxman. Well, I'd like to pose Peter's suggestion to you, because you said that we should judge autonomous weapons on the performance. And we've seen in the last decade that drones, for example, in particular, are doing jobs that humans wouldn't do, the so-called dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs. But this is particularly where you ask for regulation, because the regulation is only there where humans have not been so far. So is it morally right to say that we should adapt the norms to the practice rather than the other way around? My second question is to Peter. They're short. Aren't we in a way naively overburdening human decision-making processes in the complex context of the military by saying that only human beings are able to judge right? Isn't it also possible that we say that if in some situations, machines should also override human decision-makings in order making processes in order to avert atrocities? And my last point is a suggestion. Maybe we can reconcile both positions of the two of you by saying we should not make lethal autonomous weapons lethal, but non-lethal.
Thank you. And just over here.
Hi, my question is quite brief as well. It's for Mr. Waxman. You talk quite a lot about the fact that we don't know the potential for these weapons to make warfare more ethical. So in that sense, you build quite an experimental argument. And so my question is, if we step back from putting aside the ethical nature of the weapons themselves, is it not quite unethical to use human life in this sense in an experimental way? And if so, then how could you possibly decide what soldiers, what civilians, and in what context should we experiment this type of weaponry on?
I'll go to Peter first. Final brief answers.
I guess on the first question of both the utopianness of a non-ban and also the questions of empathy, I think sort of tie into the second question. I think it is sort of unrealistic to believe that a small group of countries or even a handful of countries at the forefront of this technology are going to be the ones who develop the most humane sorts of regulations for these systems, they're obviously going to be invested in their particular sort of security measures, and they're going to structure the regulations that they abide by to suit that. And I think we've seen, the case example of drone warfare as it's been promulgated in the last few years, not really being something that is extensible globally, right? This isn't something the precedents that we really want to be set, a completely covert sort of process by which people are targeted, individuals are targeted, categories of action are targeted, and the criteria for this is very obscure. So I don't think those are good models at all. I think on the psychological question and whether we're overburdening people or how do we account for human empathy, I think these are very complicated questions. And I think keeping the human as an element of these systems so that there is this, maybe a debate between what the information systems are telling the humans and the humans having to wrestle with that and deliberate with that is a good thing, that it's not too sort of efficient at automatically casting these decisions, which are maybe not the best decisions, right? At least there is some competition of perspectives and ideas if we have multiple humans involved or multiple computers and humans involved, but definitely humans involved in these fundamental decisions. And I think there's also questions to be asked about lethality and non-lethality, and as well as less lethal weapons. I think there's a range of different ways in which these machines could pose threats to human rights, and we don't really want human rights to be revoked from people automatically without any kind of due process or ability to sort of petition grievances or things like that. And when we box it all up and put it in a piece of software, it becomes obscure and inaccessible. And it is indeed a very dangerous experiment. And so I would also want to know, how do you frame the evaluations of these things? How do you create some kind of test scenario that's going to be applicable? And what we have seen through the history of all of these technologies, and indeed the history of science, is it's done by trial and error. And where are these errors going to be?
Thank you.
Great. I'll just summarize and address as many of these questions as I can. First, regarding non-lethal, or sometimes referred to as less than lethal technologies, I think the integration of autonomous or highly automated systems and less than lethal technologies may open up some other opportunities here. I mean, as we project out into the future, it's not so unreasonable to assume that just as automation and autonomous decision-making, artificial intelligence are going to get better, that munitions technology and the capability of applying force in more discriminate and perhaps non-lethal ways may also grow, and that may create new opportunities also for not just better military operational effectiveness, but also more humane military operations. Secondly, my position, as I said at the beginning, is I think the best way to deal with these issues is to regulate rather than ban. We've heard a lot of arguments about why regulation is going to be difficult. I agree it's going to be difficult, but if you can't overcome those problems with regulation, and especially get states at the forefront of this technology on board, then you're not going to get an effective ban either. Third is, I think we should be very demanding. We should be demanding a lot of ourselves as an international community in terms of our moral behavior in warfare. And the way that we do that is the idea of adopting these technologies is not that we define morality down, but we define it up by demanding a lot in terms of performance of what we expect from human operators and what we expect from machines that we may put to use. That's what I'm talking about when I say that we ought to articulate and we ought to be willing to discuss very publicly and debate the standards and metrics by which we judge our systems. Finally, I agree that as with any technology and thinking about how we regulate it, there are some moral quandaries and some dangers to going down a path and making course adjustments as we go. I think for many people that I've talked to, the idea of a preemptive ban intuitively seems like the safer route. I would just say that aside from the concerns I've already raised about enforceability of a ban, I think there is a good possibility that a preemptive ban would cause us to forego technologies that would be life-saving not just for troops but for civilians, and those who push for a ban need to acknowledge, I think, that as a moral cost to the ban, that we are foregoing those advantages.
Thank you. So before I close, I said we'll take another vote at the end. So again, the motion was specifically, should there be an absolute ban on autonomous systems capable of using lethal force? So all of those saying there should be a ban. I'm not counting you two. Didn't count you before. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Interesting. I say interesting because the people in the room have changed. Some have arrived after we did the vote before, and some have left, but I have exactly the same number for the ban as before. I counted 46, and I counted again 46. And now, who is against a preemptive absolute ban at this stage? I don't think we're going to have time, though, for more explanations.
Technology means that you're talking about war and you are accepting war. And talking about the laws of war and empathy and violation of standards and responsible states is absolute nonsense. There is no war that can be responsible.
Thank you.
And that's why I'm against this sort of talk about technology, because it subconsciously accepts that you wage war.
Thank you. So we ended up with very similar numbers at the end, but different people. I did notice some changes, but ended up the overall numbers staying the same. I'd like at this stage just to close by saying we've heard two brilliant presentations. I think from both sides we can agree that there are risks and we need to act quickly. The question is, do we want to act by taking a preemptive ban, or do we want to look at those risks alongside possible advantages and keep an eye on the technologies and see whether they should be regulated? I think it's also important to point out that this whole discussion is part of a wider discussion over the role that robots and autonomous systems are going to play in society more generally. And you know, robots driving cars, driverless cars was mentioned. We'll have perhaps robots performing surgery. There will be all sorts of areas in which we're going to have to talk about the role of machines with regards to humans, our interaction with them, and the various risks and advantages. So clearly there's a lot more work to be done. We need to be bringing together the lawyers, the philosophers, the scientists, and the policymakers to figure out how to proceed. But in the meantime, I'd like to give a big thanks to both of our speakers for excellent presentations, as well as the audience for all of your contribution, and hopefully we've furthered some of our understanding of this issue. And I will also just hand over to Andrew Clapham for a final word.
Just a very final word, because nobody has actually thanked you, Noam Lovell. Thank you for putting this together. And very briefly, thanks again to both of our speakers for coming a long way to provide us with an excellent debate. I just wanted to tell you about the two forthcoming events that the Academy will have, which were alluded to. The first is the launch of the Weapons Law Encyclopedia, which will be launched on the 2nd of December in the Vieux Bois, that's the restaurant opposite the International Committee of the Red Cross next to the United Nations, at 1:15. And Maya Braham and Dr. Stuart Casey-Meslin will be presenting their work. This is a guide to the legality of some of the weapons that we've been talking about, but also goes into a lot of the other weapons that we haven't mentioned. It will be forthcoming as an app, which you will be able to download onto your iPhone and your Android and so on. But you won't be able to access a sort of one-click buy option to buy the weapon. It will just tell you about the legality of the weapons. We're not encouraging war. We're actually trying to bring war within the realms of law. And very briefly, the second is the launch of the War Report, which the Academy will launch under the editorship of Stuart Casey-Meslin on 10th of December. which is Human Rights Day. It's the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is, for the first time, a collection of the number of armed conflicts over the last 12 months of 2012, where the Academy has categorized whether or not these constitute international armed conflicts or non-international armed conflicts or not conflicts at all. And that will be launched with a revelation, if you like, as to which states we think have been subject to armed conflict and which groups were engaged in armed conflict for the year 2012. And that will be on the 10th of December in this room at 6:15. And I will try to get some heating organised. So thank you very much, and a big round of applause, please, for the three.